Today, your birth certificate is one of the most important documents you will ever own. It can help you get a passport, a driver's license, a social security number, a marriage license. It can prove your age, your place of birth, and in many cases, your citizenship. It is the first official document that connects your name to a date, a place, and a legal identity. But for most of American history, that document did not exist in anything like the form we know today. For more than a century after independence, the United States had no universal system for recording births, no standardized certificate, no national network, no reliable way to prove, with government records, exactly when or where millions of Americans had been born. If you entered the world on a farm in Ohio in 1860, or in a crowded New York tenement in 1880, the government might have had no record of your birth at all. You existed because your family knew you existed. Your neighbors knew. Your church knew. And if someone asked how old you were, the answer might come from memory, a Bible entry, a baptismal record, or the testimony of someone who remembered your mother carrying you as an infant. In early America, identity was personal before it was bureaucratic. To understand why, you have to go back to the colonial period. European settlers brought record-keeping traditions with them, but many of those traditions were religious rather than governmental. In England, parish churches had long recorded baptisms, marriages, and burials. Colonists continued that practice. A minister might write the name of a baptized child into a church ledger. A town clerk might record a marriage. A burial could be entered beside the names of other local families. Some colonies tried to formalize the process. Virginia passed a law in 1632 requiring ministers to keep records of christenings, marriages, and burials. Massachusetts followed with its own system in 1639, but enforcement was inconsistent. Records were incomplete. Some clerks were diligent, others were not. One minister might maintain careful books for years, while the next left gaps or began an entirely new ledger. Fires destroyed records. Floods ruined them. Frontier settlements sometimes had no official record keeper at all, so for generations, the most important record of a person's birth often sat inside the family home, the family Bible. Those large Bibles sometimes contained blank pages, specifically intended for births, marriages, and deaths. A parent might write, "Born March 4, named Samuel," or "Daughter Mary, born in winter." That handwritten line could become the closest thing a person had to an official birth record. Baptismal records offered another source, but baptism and birth were not necessarily the same date. A child might be baptized days or months after being born. Some churches recorded both dates, others did not. And then there was community memory. In a small town, identity did not require documentation because everybody knew everybody else. You were known as someone's son, someone's daughter, the child born during the terrible storm, the boy born the year the mill burned. If your age needed to be verified, people asked those who remembered, a midwife, a neighbor, a minister, a relative. That system worked surprisingly well in communities where families stayed in one place for generations. Then America began moving. During the 19th century, families crossed the Appalachians, settled the Ohio Valley, moved onto the Great Plains, and continued farther west. When someone moved hundreds or thousands of miles from home, the human network that had validated identity disappeared. Nobody in the new town had attended the baptism. Nobody remembered the birth. Nobody knew whether the newcomer was 23 or 27. A person could effectively arrive with no verifiable past. For individuals, that could feel liberating. For government, it became increasingly difficult. The United States Constitution required a national census every 10 years because representation in Congress depended on population. The first census took place in 1790. Federal marshals and assistants traveled across the young nation counting people household by household. The information they collected was extraordinarily limited. They recorded the head of household and broad categories of residents. They were not producing individual birth records. They were not creating legal identities. They were counting population. The 1790 census reported just under 4 million people, though even leaders such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson believed many had been missed. The nation was too large. Roads were poor. People lived in remote places. The census could estimate how many Americans existed without knowing precisely who those Americans were. For much of the 19th century, that was considered good enough. The federal government did not need an exact birthday to tax property. Military recruiters did not always require documentary proof of age. If a young man looked old enough to serve, he might serve. Voting qualifications were often handled through local knowledge and community judgment. The American state was still relatively small. Then several major changes made that old system impossible to maintain. The first was immigration. Between the early 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, tens of millions of Europeans arrived in the United States. Cities exploded in size. New York, Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia. Neighborhoods filled with people who had no long-standing relationship with local officials or established families. The old method of identity by reputation collapsed. A factory manager could not simply ask the neighborhood minister about a worker who had arrived from Italy 6 months earlier. A city official could not rely on neighbors to know the life history of thousands of newly arrived families. Urban America became a society of strangers. At the same time, progressive-era reformers became increasingly obsessed with data. They mapped poverty, counted the unemployed, documented tenement crowding, tracked disease, studied sanitation. They believed social problems could be solved only if government understood them statistically. But public health officials faced a major obstacle. They did not know how many babies were actually being born. Without reliable birth registration, infant mortality rates were difficult to measure. Disease patterns were harder to understand. Health departments could not easily compare one city with another. Then came another crisis that made age verification urgent: child labor. At the beginning of the 20th century, enormous numbers of American children worked for wages. Many spent long hours in factories, mines, mills, and agricultural labor. Children who today would be in elementary or middle school operated machinery, carried heavy loads, and worked in dangerous industrial environments. Reformers began demanding minimum working ages. But a law saying a child had to be 14 meant very little if nobody could prove whether that child was 12, 14, or 16. The system relied heavily on parental affidavits. A mother or father would swear that a child was old enough to work. The problem was obvious. Poor families often depended on a child's income. If claiming a 12-year-old was 14 meant food on the table, parents had a powerful incentive to lie. Some notaries barely checked. Factory inspectors complained that enforcement was almost impossible. Family Bible entries could be changed. A baptismal record might show only a ceremony date, and sometimes the child's own parents did not know the exact birth date. That sounds almost impossible from a modern perspective. But age was not always treated as the precise legal fact it is today. Many adults knew approximately when they had been born. Some remembered the season, some remembered a major event. A census taker might ask for an age and receive a guess. Reformers gradually reached an important conclusion. If child labor laws were going to work, proof of age had to come from something independent of the family. A document created close to the moment of birth, recorded by an outside authority, filed somewhere permanent, retrievable years later. In other words, a birth certificate. New York became an important early example. In 1903, the state gave preference to birth certificates as proof of age for employment. If no birth certificate existed, officials could turn to other records such as baptismal certificates, Bible entries, passports, immigration records, or insurance documents. A parent's sworn statement became a last resort rather than the first line of proof. Other states began adopting similar systems. But requiring a birth certificate was one thing, making sure births were actually recorded was another. In 1902, Congress established the Bureau of the Census as a permanent federal agency. Before that, census operations had largely expanded and contracted around the 10-year count. A permanent bureau gave the federal government something new. Institutional continuity, it could begin developing national standards. In 1907, the Census Bureau proposed a standard certificate of live birth that states could use. The federal government could encourage standardization, but it could not simply order every state to comply. Vital records remained primarily a state responsibility that created a slow and uneven process. The Census Bureau eventually created what became known as the birth registration area. To qualify, states had to meet minimum standards for recording births. When the system was formally established in 1915, only 10 states, and the District of Columbia met those standards. Large parts of the country still had incomplete birth registration. Rural areas were especially difficult. A child born at home might be delivered by a midwife. No doctor attended, no hospital paperwork existed. The family might report the birth to a county clerk, or they might never do it. In some parts of the country, official registration remained extremely unreliable well into the 20th century. It was not until 1933 that all 48 states had joined the National Birth Registration Area. That date is remarkable. By then, Americans had automobiles, skyscrapers, commercial radio, transcontinental aviation. The country was an industrial power. Yet universal birth registration had only just become a national reality. Even then, the system still missed people. Home births remained common, local compliance varied. Older Americans had already lived most of their lives without certificates. Then the federal government created a program that suddenly made proof of birth financially important. Social Security. In 1935, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act. The law created retirement benefits and other elements of the modern federal safety net. But eligibility depended partly on age. To receive retirement benefits, people needed to demonstrate that they were old enough. The easiest proof was a birth certificate that created an immediate problem for millions of Americans born before birth registration became reliable. Someone born in 1870 might now be 65 years old and ready to claim benefits, but no certificate had ever been created. So states began issuing delayed birth certificates. These records were produced years or even decades after the actual birth. Officials reconstructed the past using whatever evidence still existed. Old census records, church books, family Bibles, insurance documents, sworn testimony from older relatives. Imagine reaching retirement age after working your entire life and suddenly being told that the government needed you to prove the details of an event that happened more than 6 decades earlier. That was the reality for many Americans. And the burden fell hardest on people who had always been least visible to government. Rural families, poor families, Black Americans in the South, Native Americans, immigrants, people born far from hospitals and government offices. The birth certificate was becoming essential, but millions of people had entered the world before the system was ready to notice them. Then came World War II, and the need for documentary identity became impossible to ignore. Defense plants expanded across the country. Factories needed workers to build aircraft, ships, ammunition, and military equipment. But certain wartime jobs required proof of citizenship. For many Americans, that meant producing a birth certificate. Between 1940 and 1945, tens of millions of people requested certified copies of their birth records. The scale exposed just how incomplete the old system had been. Ordinary Americans who had lived their entire lives believing their identity was obvious suddenly discovered that government bureaucracy required documentary proof, and many did not have it. The country was mobilizing for global war, but a huge portion of its own population could not easily prove where or when they had been born. That crisis finally pushed the birth certificate from a reform tool into something much larger. It was becoming the foundation of modern American legal identity. And in the years immediately after the war, the government would begin building the standardized system that Americans now take for granted. The birth certificate had finally become important, but importance did not mean equality. By the 1940s, Americans were discovering that a document originally created to improve public health and verify age had become a gatekeeper to modern life. It could determine whether someone qualified for retirement benefits, whether they could work in a defense plant, whether they could obtain government identification, and whether they could prove citizenship. And the people most likely to lack that document were often the same people who had already spent generations living at the margins of government attention. Black Americans in the rural South were especially vulnerable. A child born to a sharecropping family in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, or Louisiana might have entered the world at home with the help of a midwife. No hospital, no physician, no standardized paperwork. Sometimes the birth was reported to a county clerk. Sometimes it was not. Decades later, when Social Security or wartime employment required proof of age and citizenship, that missing record became a serious legal problem. The person had always existed. The government simply had no official document proving it. Native American families faced similar problems. Many children were born in communities where state vital record systems barely reached. Some births were documented through mission records, tribal records, or local church ledgers. But those systems did not always connect cleanly with state bureaucracies. Immigrants could face a different version of the same problem. A person might have arrived in the United States as a child from a country where records were incomplete, inaccessible, or lost during war and migration. Now that person could be asked decades later to prove the exact circumstances of a birth that occurred thousands of miles away. The modern identity system was becoming standardized, but it had been built on top of more than a century of uneven documentation. That meant millions of people had to be retroactively fitted into it. Delayed birth certificates became one solution. Someone born decades earlier could apply to have a certificate created after the fact. But those applications required evidence. An old census entry might help. A family Bible could be used. A baptismal record might support the claim. An elderly relative might swear under oath that they remembered the birth. In other words, the supposedly modern documentary system often depended on the same human memory and family testimony it had been designed to replace. The difference was that now those memories were being converted into government records. By the end of World War II, the federal government understood that birth registration could no longer remain a loose collection of state practices. In 1946, responsibility for national vital statistics standards was reorganized under the Office of Vital Statistics. States still maintained their own birth records. That basic structure remains important. There is no single federal birth certificate office producing certificates for every American. Birth registration has historically remained a state and local responsibility. But the federal government increasingly set standards so that the records could be comparable and useful across the country. That standardization transformed the birth certificate. What had once been a simple record of a child's arrival became part of a national statistical system. Public health researchers could use birth records to measure infant mortality. Governments could compare outcomes across states. Officials could study maternal health. Population trends could be tracked with far greater precision. Over time, the certificate expanded. Early forms captured relatively limited information. Later versions added more demographic and medical details. The document became useful not just to the person named on it, but to public health agencies, demographers, researchers, and governments trying to understand entire populations. That created a strange dual identity for the birth certificate. For an individual, it was personal. Your name, your parents, your birthplace, your date of birth. For the state, it was data. One record among millions, one birth added to a population count, one data point helping government understand who was being born, where, and under what circumstances. And that represents a profound change from the way Americans had understood identity a century earlier. In early America, identity was relational. You were who the people around you said you were. Your family knew you. Your church knew you. Your neighbors knew your story. If someone questioned your age, witnesses could testify. The modern system works differently. Your identity exists in records, a database, a certificate, a file number, an official seal. That gives people extraordinary certainty, but it also makes legal identity increasingly dependent on bureaucratic recognition. Without the document, ordinary tasks can become difficult. School enrollment, employment, government benefits, travel, identification, marriage, licensing. The birth certificate became the root document from which other forms of identity could grow. Later federal requirements strengthened that role even further. By the second half of the 20th century, proving age, citizenship, and identity had become increasingly tied to documentary evidence. Social Security rules reinforced the importance of birth records. Passports relied heavily on them. State identification systems increasingly treated them as foundational proof. The paper in the drawer was no longer merely a record of something that happened decades ago. It had become the key that unlocked other documents. That is why the history matters, because the birth certificate did not emerge from a single grand plan. Nobody in 1776 sat down and designed the identity system Americans use today. It developed because one crisis after another exposed the weaknesses of an informal society. Immigration overwhelmed community-based identity. Urbanization placed millions of strangers together. Child labor laws required accurate proof of age. Public health officials needed reliable statistics. Social Security required retirement age verification. World War II required proof of citizenship for enormous numbers of workers. Each problem pushed government toward the same answer. Document the birth, do it when it happens. Keep the record, make it permanent. Then use that record throughout the person's life. The process took more than a century, and even when the system became widespread, it remained imperfect. Some communities continued to be underregistered. People born outside hospitals were easier to miss. Poor families sometimes had less access to the bureaucracy required to correct errors. Names could be misspelled. Dates could be entered incorrectly. Parents could be listed inconsistently. Adoption, immigration, and changes in family structure created additional complications. The document looked authoritative, but it was still created by human beings. That is another part of the story worth remembering. Government records feel objective because they are official. But every official record begins with someone writing information down: a doctor, a nurse, a midwife, a clerk, a parent, a hospital administrator. The modern system reduced uncertainty enormously. It did not eliminate human error. Still, the shift from memory to documentation changed American life. It also changed the relationship between citizens and government. Before universal registration, the state often knew relatively little about an individual person. It might know where property was located. It might know who was listed in a census household. It might know who paid taxes or served in the military. But there was no complete documentary chain beginning at. Modern bureaucracy created that chain. Birth certificate, social security number, school records, driver's license, passport, employment records, tax records. The individual became increasingly legible to the state. That word matters. Legible. A person could now be counted, categorized, verified, tracked through official systems, and connected to benefits and obligations that brought enormous advantages. It made fraud more difficult. It helped governments administer pensions. It supported public health. It made age restrictions enforceable. It allowed people to prove citizenship without producing a room full of witnesses. But it also created new forms of exclusion. If the bureaucracy failed to recognize you, accessing the rights attached to that bureaucracy became harder. A person without documentation might find themselves caught in a paradox. They could live their entire life in one country and still struggle to prove the legal facts of that life. That problem has never disappeared completely. The source material points to a larger global reality as well. Millions of children around the world still lack registered births. Some may be born in areas affected by conflict. Others live far from functioning government offices. Some belong to communities that historically distrust or remain disconnected from state systems. Without registration, children can face barriers to education, healthcare, legal protection, and later employment. The absence of a birth certificate does not make someone less human, but in a bureaucratic world, it can make them less visible. And visibility has consequences. This is why birth registration became closely tied to efforts against child labor and trafficking. If a government cannot prove a child's age, enforcing age-based protections becomes much harder. The same problem that confronted American reformers more than a century ago still exists elsewhere today. How do you protect a 12-year-old from being treated as a 16-year-old if nobody can prove when the child was born? The document becomes more than paperwork. It becomes evidence of age, evidence of parentage, evidence that a specific child exists within a legal system. That does not mean birth certificates are politically neutral. As they became more important, arguments over what they should record also intensified. Questions about citizenship, parentage, identity, immigration status, legal recognition. Each debate reflects the extraordinary power attached to a document that once barely existed. The certificate can look mundane, a rectangle of paper covered in official language, but behind it sits a much larger question. Who has the authority to define your legal identity? For most of human history, the answer was largely your family and community. In modern states, the answer increasingly became government institutions. That transition can feel unsettling because people naturally think of identity as something deeply personal. Yet legally, identity requires recognition. The birth certificate is the moment when private existence becomes public record. A baby is born, a family gains a child. And simultaneously, the state gains a citizen or resident whose existence can now be documented. That is the bargain built into modern registration. The government records you. In return, you gain access to systems that depend on verified identity. Benefits, rights, education, mobility, employment, documentation. At the same time, the state gains the ability to count you, regulate you, tax you, and potentially draft you. The same system that makes a passport possible also makes population administration possible. That dual purpose has been present from the beginning. The government did not create birth registration purely to help individuals. It needed reliable information to function. And individuals eventually needed the government's records to function inside society. The two became dependent on one another. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the American birth certificate had evolved into a far more detailed document than its early predecessors. The standard forms expanded to include medical and demographic information useful for national health statistics. Information surrounding the pregnancy, delivery, parental characteristics, and newborn health could become part of the underlying record. Again, much of that information was not there primarily because the individual would need it someday. It was collected because aggregated birth data helps governments identify broader patterns. Are premature births increasing? Are infant mortality rates changing? Are certain regions experiencing different maternal health outcomes? Birth certificates became tools for answering questions about society itself. That is a remarkable transformation. A document that began as a way to establish that one child had been born became part of the machinery for understanding millions of births. And yet, for the person whose name appears at the top, the certificate remains intensely individual. It might sit untouched for years, then suddenly it becomes essential. You need a passport. You lose another form of identification. You apply for benefits. You need to establish citizenship. You request a certified copy from the state where you were born. And most people never stop to think about how recent that experience really is. Your great-great-grandparents may have lived their entire lives without such a document. Your great-grandparents may have needed delayed certificates created decades after they were born. Some Americans alive during the middle of the 20th century had to reconstruct their own beginnings using church books and relatives' memories. That is not ancient history. It happened within the lifetime of the modern United States. The country could build railroads across a continent before it could reliably register every baby. It could fight a civil war, build massive cities, invent new industries, send armies overseas, and still lack a complete system proving when millions of its people were born. That contradiction tells us something important about how governments develop. States do not become modern all at once. They build systems piece by piece, usually after something breaks. Child labor enforcement breaks. Create better age records. Retirement benefits become impossible to administer. Demand proof of birth. War industries need citizenship verification, standardized documents. Every new institution creates a need for another institution. Eventually, what once seemed unnecessary becomes indispensable. Today, the birth certificate feels inevitable. It was not. It was built slowly, unevenly, and in response to pressure. That history also explains why documentation is never merely administrative. Every record-keeping system makes choices about who is easy to count and who is easy to miss. Urban hospital births were easier to document than remote home births. Families with access to government offices had advantages over those without it. Communities already marginalized by race, poverty, geography, or immigration status were more likely to fall through the cracks. The system eventually became more universal. But the gaps were never evenly distributed. That may be the most important lesson hidden inside this ordinary piece of paper. A birth certificate looks like proof of something obvious. Of course you were born, of course you exist. Why should anyone need proof? Because modern institutions cannot operate on, of course, they require records. And for more than a century, America functioned without a reliable one. So the next time you see your birth certificate, look at it differently. It is not just a document containing your name. It is the product of centuries of change. Church registers, family Bibles, census takers riding on horseback, children working in factories, parents altering ages so families could survive. Reformers trying to enforce labor laws, older Americans searching for proof so they could receive Social Security, workers during World War II scrambling to establish citizenship, state clerks creating delayed records from memories and faded documents. All of those stories are folded into the system that produced the certificate sitting in your drawer. That paper represents certainty. But it also represents power. The government recognizes that you were born at a particular time and place. That recognition follows you through life. And in exchange, your existence becomes part of the machinery of the state. Countable, documented, verifiable. The United States spent more than a century operating without that machinery. Then immigration, industrialization, reform, economic crisis, and war made it impossible to continue without it. The modern birth certificate was not invented because America suddenly decided identity mattered. It was invented because a modern nation eventually discovered that it could no longer function without knowing exactly who its people were. And that is what makes the document so much more interesting than it looks. It is not simply proof that you were born. It is evidence of the moment when America learned that in a modern state, existence itself had to become a record.